Nathan Carter, a seasoned judge of the Texas Supreme Court, had always prided himself on blending into the background. As a black man in a position of authority, he knew that attention often meant trouble, especially in a town like Terrell. His old, reliable 2008 Toyota Camry was a far cry from the luxury cars many other judges drove, and that suited him just fine. No bodyguards, no flashy vehicles, just him and the open road as he made his way to court. It was a Wednesday morning, and he had just grabbed a quick cup of coffee from a corner shop, his mind still a bit foggy from the early start. Nathan glanced in his rearview mirror, noticing the familiar blue and red lights flicker to life behind him. He sighed inwardly. Another routine traffic stop, probably just another officer trying to meet a quota. He signaled to turn left onto Greenway Street, instinctively checking his mirrors as he did so, a habit formed from years of driving with caution. But as he slowed down and pulled to the side of the road by a gas station, the cruiser remained just a few feet behind him, and the officer was already approaching his car with a brisk, angry pace. The officer, Travis Hensley, a young white man with a thick build, reached his window in record time. His face was already tight with anger, his eyes scanning Nathan's vehicle as though he had already decided something was wrong. "You in a rush or something?" Hensley barked, not even bothering to greet him or explain the reason for the stop. Nathan remained calm, keeping his voice steady. "Good morning, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" "License and registration," Hensley snapped, ignoring Nathan's question entirely. His hand hovered near his belt as if waiting for Nathan to do something wrong, his body language already aggressive. Nathan could feel the hostility in the air, but he remained composed. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he reached for his wallet in the glove compartment. "I'm reaching into my glove box now, officer," he said, narrating each movement. Hensley's eyes narrowed, his impatience rising. "Don't move so slow. You think you're funny or something?" His voice was low but laced with venom, and Nathan could smell the stale coffee on his breath as he leaned in closer to the window. Nathan suppressed a sigh, trying to keep his irritation in check. "I'm cooperating, sir. Here's my license." Before he could finish the sentence, Hensley jerked the door open without warning. "Get out of the car," Hensley ordered, his voice sharp with authority. Nathan's stomach clenched as the command hit him like a ton of bricks. He didn't argue, though. He knew better than to escalate things with an officer who was already on edge. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, keeping his movements calm and controlled. The moment his feet hit the ground, something happened that Nathan hadn't prepared for. A slap, hard and sharp, rang across his cheek. The sound of it echoed in the quiet morning air, louder than the hum of the nearby gas station pumps. The sting lingered, and Nathan tasted blood for a split second. His head whipped to the side and his blazer slipped off his shoulder. But it didn't matter. His cheek burned, and the crowd that had gathered around the station stood frozen, shocked by what they had just witnessed. Nathan didn't flinch, but his heart pounded in his chest. He straightened himself up, blinking against the sting in his eyes. His voice was low but steady. "You just assaulted a sitting judge," he said, his words cutting through the air like a knife. The bystanders gasped. A woman standing near the pump dropped her coffee cup, her eyes wide in disbelief. A man filling up his car muttered something under his breath. Phones were already coming out, and shaky fingers were fumbling to hit record. The moment was being captured. Nathan could feel it. Hensley stood there, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, clearly more satisfied than shocked by what he had just done. He stepped back slightly as if to compose himself, but Nathan didn't take his eyes off him. He refused to show weakness, not now, not in front of these people. Nathan reached into the inner pocket of his blazer, deliberately slow, and pulled out his gold badge. The sunlight caught it, and for a moment, the gleam of the badge seemed to stop time. The seal of the Texas Supreme Court glinted under the hot Texas sun, and the effect was immediate. The color drained from Hensley's face as if someone had pulled the life out of him. He staggered backward, eyes wide with the recognition of just how badly he had screwed up. Nathan didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The crowd around them shifted, murmurs of disbelief and anger spreading like wildfire. A man in a baseball cap shouted from across the street, "You messed up, man!" And Nathan, though his cheek throbbed with a deep, aching pain, stood tall. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was standing for every person who didn't have a badge to protect them. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly reached into his blazer and pulled out his badge. The sunlight caught the gold, gleaming under the bright Texas sky, and in that moment, the entire atmosphere shifted. The crowd, once uncertain, now seemed to collectively understand the gravity of the situation. They weren't just witnessing an assault. They were watching a clash of power, and Nathan wasn't going to let it be swept under the rug. The officer, Travis Hensley, froze for a moment, his face paling as he processed what was happening. His fingers twitched, and his eyes shifted nervously between Nathan's face and the badge in his hand. The cocky confidence he had displayed earlier vanished. For a brief second, he was no longer in control of the situation. Nathan stood tall, his gaze unwavering as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Phones were out now, recording every second of the unfolding drama. Hensley stood still for a moment too long, unsure of what to do next. He looked like a man who had realized too late that he had crossed a line. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he stumbled backward. Nathan noticed the twitch of Hensley's hand, almost reaching for his weapon, but the crowd, now a circle of witnesses, prevented him from making any rash moves. "Put that phone down!" Hensley snapped at a teenager filming across the street. His voice cracked with frustration, but the teenager didn't budge. He continued recording. The officer's tension was palpable, and Nathan could see the panic start to take hold. "You assaulted me in front of witnesses," Nathan said evenly, his voice steady but carrying authority. "You're going to answer for that." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Nathan wasn't just speaking for himself now. He was speaking for every person who had ever been wrongly targeted or treated unjustly. The crowd seemed to understand that too. Their anger was growing, and murmurs of disbelief were turning into shouts of support. Hensley's face flushed red as he fumbled for his radio. "Requesting backup. Possible disturbance at the Shell station on Greenway and Cypress," he muttered, his voice shaky. He didn't mention that he was the cause of it all. He only sought to justify his actions, to shift the blame. But Nathan wasn't having it. "I'm not leaving until Lieutenant Reeves gets here," Nathan said, his tone resolute. He wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not after what had just happened. As more cars pulled up, officers began to flood the scene. A Latina officer and a white officer stepped out of one of the cruisers. They immediately took in the situation, their eyes wide as they assessed what was happening. They didn't immediately approach Nathan. He could see them glancing nervously at Hensley, still standing awkwardly by his patrol car. It was clear that the officers were unsure how to handle this. Nathan spoke first. "This officer," he said, pointing at Hensley, "assaulted me during a traffic stop. You're all witnesses to this fact." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "My name is Judge Nathan Carter. I sit on the Texas Supreme Court." The two officers blinked in disbelief, their eyes darting from the badge to Nathan's face. The male officer processed the information slowly, while his partner stiffened, glancing at Hensley with a mix of confusion and suspicion. "Are you serious?" the female officer asked, narrowing her eyes as she looked at Nathan. "This can't be." "I assure you, officer," Nathan said, his voice unwavering, "this is very serious, and it's all on tape." At that moment, the gas station manager, who had been silently watching the exchange, spoke up. "I've got cameras," he said, his voice clear and firm. "Everything is on tape." The implication was undeniable. Hensley's actions had been recorded, and there was no escaping it. Hensley's shoulders sagged. He looked defeated, his once confident stance now crumbling under the weight of his actions. His fingers trembled as he reached for his radio, but the crowd, the witnesses, and the overwhelming evidence around him had left him with nowhere to hide. Nathan watched him, his cheek still burning from the slap, but his heart was resolute. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been mistreated. And as Hensley's mask of control shattered, Nathan knew that this moment, this act of defiance, wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about something far bigger. The air was thick with tension, and the crowd's murmurs only grew louder as they realized the significance of what had just unfolded. Nathan stood firm, his posture unyielding despite the deep ache in his cheek. The slap still throbbed, but the sting was nothing compared to the weight of the moment. He was no longer just a judge. He was a symbol of something larger, something far more important than any individual confrontation. Minutes later, the screech of sirens echoed in the distance. The arrival of Lieutenant Vernon Reeves marked a shift in the power dynamic. A black SUV with government plates pulled into the lot, and the doors opened before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. Lieutenant Reeves, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and dark sunglasses, stepped out. His presence was commanding. As he surveyed the scene, his eyes immediately locked onto Nathan. "Judge Carter," Reeves said, his voice low and controlled. He walked through the gathering officers, making his way toward Nathan. His face was set in stone, but there was no mistaking the underlying concern in his expression. "Are you all right?" Nathan didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply tilted his head slightly, allowing Reeves to see the red, swelling handprint on his cheek. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had paused, holding its breath. Reeves's jaw twitched once. He turned to Hensley, who was standing awkwardly by his cruiser, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "What the hell happened here?" Reeves asked, his voice controlled but carrying a dangerous edge. Hensley's mouth opened, but nothing coherent came out. He was a man caught in his own lies, struggling to find a way out. Before he could say anything, Nathan spoke. "This officer," Nathan said evenly, pointing to Hensley, "pulled me over without cause. He demanded that I exit my vehicle, and when I complied, he struck me across the face. All of this happened before he even verified my identity." The crowd seemed to lean in, sensing the gravity of Nathan's words. A few people in the crowd whispered angrily under their breath, while others continued to record the incident, their phones raised like weapons. The tension was palpable. Hensley, still standing by his cruiser, finally spoke, his voice weak. "I didn't know who he was. I thought he was a threat," he stammered, his words rushed and desperate. Reeves didn't flinch. He stepped closer to Hensley, his towering frame imposing as he placed a hand on his shoulder. "You thought he was a threat?" Reeves repeated slowly, almost as if he couldn't believe the words. "You thought it was acceptable to strike a man, any man, because you didn't recognize him?" Hensley swallowed hard, his face turning beet red. He opened his mouth again, but the words didn't come. Nathan watched the young officer falter, his arrogance unraveling with every passing second. Hensley had thought he could get away with this, but with the crowd, the camera footage, and now the looming presence of Lieutenant Reeves, his chances were slipping away fast. "Hand over your weapon and your badge, Travis," Reeves said, his voice as cold as steel. There was no room for debate in his tone. Hensley's eyes widened. "Lieutenant, you can't be serious." "I'm deadly serious," Reeves cut him off, his voice low but firm. "You assaulted a Supreme Court judge. You're lucky this doesn't end in handcuffs right now." There was a long, tense pause. Hensley's hand shook as he reluctantly unclipped his badge and handed it over. His sidearm followed soon after, the metal glinting in the sunlight. He looked smaller now, deflated, as though the weight of his actions had finally dawned on him. Nathan watched the exchange silently, his expression impassive. The slap on his cheek was still sore, but the real pain, the real injustice, had been Hensley's complete disregard for the law and for basic human decency. And now that reckoning had arrived. A few more officers moved in, escorting Hensley toward another patrol car, their hands hovering near their hips in case of further escalation. The crowd was still buzzing, but now the energy was different, less confused, more focused. They had witnessed something monumental, and they weren't going to let it be forgotten. Reeves turned back to Nathan, his face softening slightly. "We've got medical on the way," he said, his voice carrying a note of apology. "I'm deeply sorry for what happened." Nathan nodded once, his eyes never leaving Hensley as he was led away. "See that it's handled properly," he said, his voice steady. There was no bitterness in his words, only the quiet resolve of a man who had seen injustice and who knew it would take more than a slap to silence him. Nathan didn't have to wait long for the aftermath to unfold. The news spread faster than wildfire, and by the time he returned to his modest home that evening, his phone was buzzing nonstop with calls, texts, and emails. Journalists, colleagues, civil rights organizations, all wanting his statement, all wanting his perspective. The footage of the slap, now circulating across the internet, had gone viral. What had started as a local incident in a small town was quickly becoming a national conversation. The support came in waves. Strangers, acquaintances, and even people from other states reached out, expressing solidarity. Some were simply shocked by the injustice. Others were inspired by Nathan's calm composure in the face of an unjust assault. One email from a law student in Dallas read, "Because of you, I've decided to become a lawyer. I want to fight for justice like you did today." Nathan read it with a quiet sigh, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't asked for any of this, but it seemed that his stand was resonating with people in ways he couldn't have predicted. On the other side of the conversation, there were the voices of those who defended Travis Hensley. Talk radio was flooded with calls from people questioning whether the officer's actions had been truly malicious or if they were simply the result of a misunderstanding. Some tried to paint Nathan as someone who had provoked the situation, while others, mostly those who didn't know the full story, tried to justify Hensley's behavior by claiming that he was just doing his job. But as the days passed, the evidence piled up. The security footage from the gas station was irrefutable. The recordings made by witnesses on their phones showed the officers' escalating aggression, and the public outcry grew louder. Nathan was no longer just a judge. He had become the focal point of a much larger conversation about police accountability, racial injustice, and the treatment of Black men in America. The protests started small, a handful of people gathering outside the gas station where the incident had occurred. But as the days went on, the numbers grew. People from across Terrell, and even from other towns, showed up to demand justice for Nathan and for the countless others who had faced similar mistreatment. The chants of "Justice for Nathan Carter" rang through the streets. It was a peaceful protest, but it was clear that the community was ready to stand up for what was right. Nathan could feel the pressure mounting. Though he was deeply moved by the support, he knew that this fight was far from over. It wasn't just about him. It was about the system that allowed people like Hensley to wield unchecked power. It was about the people who had been silenced for far too long, their voices drowned out by the weight of inequality. One afternoon, a representative from the Texas Civil Rights Coalition called Nathan. They had already mobilized a team of legal experts to help push the case forward. "We've got your back," the representative said. "This isn't just about an assault on you. This is about holding the system accountable. The country is watching, Judge Carter, and we're going to make sure Hensley pays for what he did." Nathan appreciated the offer of support, but part of him still felt like this wasn't the battle he had expected to fight. As a judge, his job had always been to interpret the law, to make decisions based on facts and evidence. But now he was thrust into the role of a symbol, whether he liked it or not. The media, the protests, the conversations that were taking place all over the country, he hadn't asked for any of it. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now. The next few days were a blur. Nathan spent his time preparing for what would come next, both personally and professionally. He had made the decision to testify in court, to ensure that justice was served. He knew the trial wouldn't be easy. There would be attempts to discredit him, to shift blame, to minimize what had happened. But he couldn't let that happen. And while the public outcry continued to grow, so did the pressure on the authorities. The mayor of Terrell, along with members of the city council, called for a meeting with Nathan. He had no intention of shaking hands or smiling for the cameras. They were scared, and he knew it. The idea that a judge, someone who represented the very system they were supposed to uphold, could be treated like this had shaken them all to the core. They weren't interested in truth. They were interested in making sure their town didn't burn with the flames of scandal. Nathan declined their invitation. "I'm not interested in shaking hands or smiling for cameras," he said flatly when his assistant asked him if he would attend the meeting. "If they want to show me respect, they should start by making sure Hensley is held accountable." And so the stage was set for what would be a long, complicated fight. A fight for justice, not just for Nathan, but for everyone who had been mistreated, overlooked, and oppressed. As Nathan prepared himself for the next phase of the battle, he knew that this was only the beginning. The courtroom was packed the day Nathan took the stand. It wasn't just a trial for him anymore. It had become a symbol of the ongoing fight for justice. for the countless people who had suffered at the hands of officers like Travis Hensley. The room was filled with reporters, legal professionals, and even everyday citizens who had come to witness the unfolding drama. But Nathan didn't feel like a hero. He wasn't here for applause. He was here to make sure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. Hensley sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than he ever had before. Gone was the swagger he had displayed when he first confronted Nathan. Now he slouched in his chair, his hands trembling slightly, his face pale. His attorney, a sharp-faced woman from Dallas named Marla Whitby, kept whispering in his ear, trying to reassure him. But it was clear that Hensley had already lost the battle. Nathan took the witness stand with quiet dignity, his movements deliberate. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, his voice steady as he spoke. When the prosecutor asked him to describe what had happened, Nathan didn't embellish. He didn't exaggerate. He simply told the truth. "I was pulled over without cause," Nathan began, his voice calm and even. "Officer Hensley demanded that I exit my vehicle without explaining why. When I complied, he struck me across the face. He never verified my identity, never gave me a reason for the stop. His actions were unwarranted and unjust." The room was silent as Nathan spoke. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, the weight of their attention, but he didn't let it shake him. This wasn't about making himself the center of attention. It was about ensuring that the truth was heard, that people knew what had happened. Marla Whitby, Hensley's defense attorney, stood up for cross-examination. "Judge Carter," she began, her voice sharp, "you're claiming that Officer Hensley acted without cause, but we know that traffic stops are often unpredictable. Couldn't he have been reacting to something he perceived as a threat?" Nathan didn't flinch. He had been prepared for this. "No, Ms. Whitby. What Officer Hensley perceived as a threat was based purely on assumptions. He didn't know who I was. He didn't ask. His response was to escalate the situation unnecessarily. That is not how the law is supposed to work." The defense attorney fumbled for words, trying to deflect and shift the narrative. "But surely you must understand the stress officers face when making quick decisions in potentially dangerous situations. Couldn't you have done something to make the situation easier for him?" Nathan's response was firm, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "I did everything I was asked to do. I remained calm, I cooperated. His actions, not mine, escalated the situation, and that is why we are here today." The courtroom was still. Nathan's words hung in the air, undeniable and true. The jury, the audience, the media, they were all listening. The defense had nothing left to say. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no denying it. When the closing arguments were made, the prosecutor didn't waste any time. What happened here was an abuse of power. Officer Hensley violated Judge Carter's rights, and in doing so, he sent a message to every citizen that their safety, their dignity, means nothing in the face of unchecked authority. We cannot let this stand. After the final statements, the judge took only a brief moment before delivering the verdict. The room was on edge as the gavel slammed down, echoing through the tense silence. "Guilty," the judge declared. "Travis Hensley is found guilty of battery, abuse of authority, and violation of civil rights under color of law." A collective breath seemed to be held by the crowd before it was released in a ripple of relief and applause. Nathan felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but it wasn't over. This was just the beginning of something bigger. The moment Hensley was escorted from the courtroom, still in cuffs, Nathan stood tall, his face calm. The cameras were flashing, microphones shoved toward him, but he didn't flinch. In the hallway outside the courtroom, reporters were swarming, shouting questions. But Nathan only spoke one sentence. "My name is Judge Nathan Carter," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "What happened to me happens to too many people who don't have a title or a badge to protect them. But we will keep fighting until justice is for everyone, until dignity is for everyone." And with that, he turned, walking past the crowd of reporters, not looking back. He didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, and the fight for justice would continue louder than ever.